Hello. We're now going to look at moral methods involving God and nature. First, looking at the playing God argument, and then turning to the unnatural argument. Each will get its own separate video. Now, the playing God argument, used in ethics. People often claim, especially in movies or TV shows dramatically, that certain decisions should not be made, or certain actions should not be done because doing so would be playing God. Now, in movies, it's often, in cases, science fiction cases, when someone is going to be tampering with genes or creating some terrifying thing, someone will just simply assert, that would be playing God. Now, simply making this assertion, saying that's playing God, would not be an argument. Now, in addition to its use for dramatic purposes in fiction, it is often used in the context of attempts at arguments. I've seen professional journalists talk about how something would be playing God, but giving no actual argument. And of course, simply saying that would be playing God, although dramatic and having rhetorical power, has no logical power. Now, in terms of making the actual argument, there are two versions. There is the literal version and the metaphorical version. So the literal version, which is literal, rests on a couple assumptions. The first, of course, would be that God exists. Now, this could, of course, be repurposed for other religions that don't have, God, but typically it's the monotheistic sort of argument. So this version, the monotheistic version, assumes God exists, taking it literally, and that God wants or commands that certain decisions should not be made, except by him perhaps, and that certain actions should not be taken, except perhaps by him. And we should, on this view, do what God wants. We should obey his commands. This often, but not always, involves an acceptance of the theory I've mentioned many times in these videos, of divine command theory. That what God commands is right because he says so, and what he forbids is wrong because he says so. Now, if someone is using an explicit appeal to divine command theory to use the playing God option, that would, of course, require supporting this theory, given reasons to believe the theory is correct. Now, there's also, in addition to the literal version, which literally accepts or requires that God exists and God makes certain commands, there's the more metaphorical version. So, looked at metaphorically, this method would be based on the assumption that people should not make decisions or take actions as if they were God. And interestingly, as someone who doesn't believe in God could still use this dramatic appeal. Now, to use the metaphorical method, what it means to make decisions or take actions as if one were God must be defined. And as you might suspect, this is often defined in terms of being arrogant or acting outside the limits of normal constraints. Now, simply saying, that's playing God because someone is being very arrogant or operating outside normal limits, this needs to be argued for. Now, there's often here a tacit or hidden appeal to some other moral theory. So someone is using that's playing God as dramatic rhetoric, and they might be appealing to something else. A common version would be someone appealing to consequences, saying essentially if they are arguing, their actual argument would be that that's playing God, and you shouldn't do it because of all these terrible, terrible consequences. For example, if someone is modifying, doing genetic modification, someone may argue that this would have, say, various bad consequences, supposedly, this would all have to be supported, and then say the person is playing God, and by doing this, they put us all at risk. So essentially, the playing God part is dramatic, and they're doing a hidden appeal to consequences. So while this method does have a very strong dramatic appeal, it's usually better to just use the theory that, one is actually using, than simply playing the God card. Now, to use this method in a way that's not just drama, not just, a rhetorical device, to actually make it into an argument, There are essentially 3 steps, and then we'll look at how to build the argument. So the first step involves arguing that making the decision about or doing something would be playing God. And one cannot simply assume this, got to say why that would be like playing God. And again, this typically on the metaphorical version would involve, laying out how someone is being arrogant or exceeding the proper boundaries. Or if you're using the literal version, you would want to argue how there's a domain that's restricted solely to God, and humans, even though they can make these decisions or take those actions, simply should not. The second step is arguing that people should not play God, either literally, trying to be gods themselves somehow, or metaphorically, again, acting arrogantly or beyond the limits. And then the final step is to conclude that people should not make that decision or do that. Typical things that people would apply, playing God arguments to would often be things that involve, death, making decisions about killing people. And so common arguments against euthanasia, basically putting people to death or killing people out of mercy, would be this sort of argument, saying that deciding when people live or die would be playing God. Also, as you might imagine, like doing things like tinkering with genetics, etc., that's often seen as playing God. Another example that I saw years ago was an article addressing a method of selecting the sex, male or female, laying aside all the complications there, at birth, that too would be playing God. Now again, you just can't say that's playing God, you've got to back this up. So the playing God argument, as an argument, would look like this. The actual argument itself is pretty straightforward, but the challenge lies in supporting those critical premises. So the first premise would be to present that making a decision about something or doing something would be playing God. Now doing this sort of well supported would require having a whole other argument that supports that premise. So you would have an extended argument in which you argue for that premise. In that case, that would be the conclusion of that argument, and then you use it in this playing God argument. The second premise is that people should not play God, literally or metaphorically, and once again, that can't simply be assumed, that would have to be established, so you need like another argument to support this premise. So making this argument work would require 3 arguments. One argument to establish that doing something or deciding something would be playing God. That would support your first premise. Then an argument that shows that people shouldn't play God, supporting your second premise. And then you combine them together, premise 1 and 2, and then draw the conclusion that people should not make the decision or do this particular thing. Now, as I mentioned before, common examples of this include, tampering with genetic code, arguing people shouldn't play God in this way. Other examples are like euthanasia. Interestingly, even though people often use it for euthanasia, it's not often used for things like capital punishment or war, killing people in war. Mostly just for euthanasia. So a final sort of concern about God, again, in this literal form of the argument, this would rest on certain assumptions about God and what God wants. And as a practical matter, this playing God argument would tend to be very effective with people who share the same religious views, that have the same conception of God and what God wants and what God forbids. But not surprisingly, it would be ineffective when used on people who don't share those same religious beliefs. So kind of a serious weak point in arguments about playing God, the literal version, is ensuring that, one is presenting an argument to people who share the same view about what God wants. In that case, makes it fairly easy. Now, one could, of course, try to convince people to accept that conception of God, but that can be quite challenging. So, once someone's made a playing God argument, how can you respond to it? So this would be like if someone made the argument and you were criticizing it, or in the case of the paper, again, the paper has got the model of you present your position, argue for your position in your argument section, and then the objection reply section, you raise at least one meaningful, significant objection against your view, and the responding part of these moral methods is how to build that argument. So if the first thing in terms of responding typically wouldn't work in your paper, because this involves generally a live discussion in which you're engaging someone and they're making the argument. And so imagine you're engaged in a debate, in person, or today, like in Zoom or something, and a person says, that would be playing God and we should not do that. Well, a fair question to ask them would be to ask them to spell out exactly how one is playing God and why this is wrong. And that's a fair response. This can also be a request for the person to explicitly state their underlying theory or principle that they're using. Because, again, people often use "that's playing God" as rhetorical drama, and their actual argument, if they have one, may be something else, like an appeal to rules or appeal to consequences. So as a practical matter, just because someone throws out, playing God, they might not be using that as an argument at all, in which case the quick, response is to, essentially ask them to spell this out. So if someone says that's playing God, and you ask them to spell it out, that would not be a counterexample itself or a counterargument itself, but it would be useful in exposing the lack of argument on the other person's part, because if they've got nothing, they've got nothing. Now, also going along with this, sort of as part of the response, would to show that the person is not actually spelled out how what they're claiming is playing God, and they've not shown how it's wrong. And this again would not show that they're mistaken, because a lack of argument doesn't mean the person's claim is false. It's that they simply didn't make their case. They simply expressed their unsupported opinion with a bit of rhetoric. Now again, psychologically and rhetorically, this can be quite effective, and arguments are generally terrible as means of persuasion. But again, from the philosophical standpoint, to make this argument, a person has to spell out, how something is playing God and why that's wrong. Otherwise, they're just engaged in drama and not arguing. Now, a way to actually engage this method is similar to the consistency concerns we saw, as in our early methods, the appeal to consistency and also, consistent application methods. So if someone is arguing that you shouldn't play God in a particular case, one often effective counter, which this doesn't always work because it has a very particular requirement. Specifically, you have to use an argument by analogy, and you have to have a case where, although they say you shouldn't play God in this case, they're fine with seemingly playing God in other cases. And this essentially is an argument by an analogy. So the common way to respond to this method is to draw an analogy between what's being debated and a similar situation in which the decision making or action taken is regarded as morally acceptable, either by the person you're arguing against or the position you're arguing against, or sort of intuitively in general. For example, I mentioned earlier the debate over euthanasia. And one thing that's striking about this debate is that the very same people who argue that we can't have euthanasia, can't allow it because they're playing God, they are also tend to support the death penalty. They'll often support killing in war, and that would seem to be inconsistent. So if death penalty is acceptable and killing in war is acceptable, then it would seem to follow that euthanasia would also be morally acceptable. Now, of course, there are ways to reply to that, but this can be logically, as opposed to persuasively, effective if someone does hold seemingly inconsistent positions, like saying you can't make decisions, about life and death, that'd be playing God. So no euthanasia, but it's perfectly fine to have capital punishment or war. Now, there's ways to respond back to that. A person could argue that, war and capital punishment are different from euthanasia, but they would have to draw the distinction. Another example, genetic engineering. Now, this would be more of a general reply. You need not use this against a particular person who says this is okay and that's not okay, and here's how the analogy would work. So if someone says, modifying animals and plants is playing God, we shouldn't do that, one thing to point out with the argument by analogy is to point out that people have been altering animals and plants for thousands of years through selective breeding. The most obvious example is dogs. Dogs originated as apparently a form of wolf, and then through, centuries of selective breeding, we have created a wide range of dog breeds. They're all still dogs, but of course there's quite a bit of difference between, say, a husky and a chihuahua and a Great Dane. And we did this all through selective breeding, which essentially is, amateur genetic engineering. Now, in general, people have not been accused of playing God when they, created things like huskies, or when they've, selected cows for more meat or more milk, or have grown crops, like creating, better yielding corn through, selective, breeding, or in the case of plants, kind of just selecting them. And so you could argue by analogy that genetic engineering is just a more efficient way of achieving the ends of selective breeding. That you don't have to mess around with crossing all these things and hoping it's going to work. You can actually just go in and pick what you want. Not all the time with perfect accuracy, but more consistently. And so if it's morally acceptable for us to have created dogs and all the various crops like corn and, different cows and horses and so forth, then genetic engineering wouldn't be playing God either. Or we'd have to say that, all of that selective stuff would be wrong, and that, the creation of dogs would be, a sin against God. So that is the playing God argument. Now, of course, if you use a playing God argument, then respond back to it, you'd want to, reply to your objection to counter that. And the typical way to do that, if you're sort of bringing up an argument by analogy, to use an example, suppose you want to say that genetic engineering is playing God, make that argument, then the response would be the one I just gave, which is that we've been doing something similar for centuries. But then you could counter that response by arguing there are relevant differences between simply breeding animals and genetically modifying them. And the trick would be to show what is the relevant distinction. And you might make the point that in the case of simply breeding animals, you might say we're just still leaving a lot of it up to chance. And in the case of genetic engineering, we're going in and modifying the gene code. And that would be something one could focus on. So that is the playing God argument. Again, often just empty rhetoric, but it's so commonly used, I decided to sort of lay out how you would use it as an argument. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future when you go on to the unnatural argument.